I watched Marcus sign the divorce papers with that smug smile I'd grown to hate, his Mont Blanc pen scratching across the documents like nails on a chalkboard. The sound echoed through our marble-floored dining room, each deliberate stroke sealing what he believed was my financial doom. He thought he was so clever, hiding millions in offshore accounts while offering me a measly 100,000 in the settlement, barely enough to rent a studio apartment in our city for a single year. What he didn't know was that I died once already, murdered by his mistress Sarah in my previous life, and this time I was prepared for everything. The memory of poison still burned in my throat from that other timeline, the phantom taste of bitter almonds that had been my last sensation as I convulsed on our imported Italian marble kitchen floor. I could still hear Sarah's triumphant laugh echoing through our $15 million mansion as my vision faded to black. Still see Marcus's face as he pretended to call 911 while actually texting his lawyer about accelerating the final asset transfers that would leave me with nothing. There, Marcus said, sliding the papers across our mahogany dining table, the same table where I'd eaten my last meal in my previous life, where I'd trusted him enough to drink the coffee Sarah had prepared with such loving care. His diamond Rolex caught the afternoon light streaming through our floor-to-ceiling windows, the watch I'd bought him for our 5th anniversary with money from my grandmother's estate. Clean and simple. You get the house, I get the business assets, and we both move on with our lives. The house. Our $12 million estate in the hills overlooking the city, the one he'd already secretly mortgaged to the hilt without my knowledge, transferring all the equity to shell companies I'd never heard of. In my previous life, I'd lost even this when the mortgage payments I thought Marcus was making turned out to be fictional entries in bank statements he'd had professionally forged. I smiled sweetly, the expression feeling foreign on my face after months of playing the grieving, defeated wife. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for my teacup, not from nervousness, but from the effort it took to contain my rage. Of course, darling, I just want this nightmare to be over. Sarah emerged from our gourmet kitchen carrying a silver tray laden with bone china coffee cups, her movements deliberately graceful as she set down Marcus's cup first with practiced intimacy. She was already living here, already playing house with my husband while I was still technically his wife. Her clothes hanging in my walk-in closet, her toiletries cluttering my marble bathroom countertops. Her red Louboutin heels clicked against the marble with the confidence of a woman who believed she'd won the ultimate prize. "I made your favorite, baby," Sarah cooed to Marcus, her perfectly manicured hand with its 3-carat engagement ring, my grandmother's ring that Marcus had claimed was lost during a business trip last year, lingering possessively on his shoulder. "Colombian dark roast extra cream, no sugar." She barely glanced at me as she set down my cup, her eyes holding the same cold contempt I remembered from my death scene. The same coffee service she'd used to poison me in my previous life, though this time I'd specifically requested tea and watched her prepare it myself, never letting the cup leave my sight. The irony was delicious, though they had no idea just how deep it ran. While Marcus thought he was orchestrating my financial ruin with the same methodical precision he'd brought to building his tech empire from a garage startup into a Fortune 500 company, I was actually documenting his crimes with a thoroughness that would have impressed the FBI forensic accountants who were already building their case against him. It had started the night I'd awakened in this second life, 3 days before Marcus served me with divorce papers. I jolted awake in our king-size bed at exactly 3:17 a.m., the memories hitting me like a tsunami of betrayal and rage that nearly sent me running to the bathroom to vomit. Not just the memories of my agonizing death, the burning throat, the convulsions, the helpless terror as my body shut down, but of every conversation I'd overheard and dismissed, every phone call I'd walked in on and been told was boring business stuff, every emergency business trip to the Cayman Islands that had actually been meetings with private wealth managers and offshore banking specialists. The clarity was overwhelming. In my previous life, I'd been Rebecca Coleman, the naive art teacher who'd fallen for a tech entrepreneur's charm during a gallery opening where he'd bought every single one of my paintings because I could see the genius in them. I'd been 26, he'd been 34, and I'd been so flattered by his attention, so impressed by his confidence and success, that I'd ignored every red flag. I'd trusted too easily, loved too completely, believed too readily in the fairy tale of our whirlwind romance. When he'd proposed after 6 months with a ring that cost more than I made in a year, I'd said yes without hesitation. When he'd suggested eloping in Vegas because big weddings are just for show, I'd agreed, cutting ties with friends who'd expressed concerns about the rushed timeline. I'd been content with my modest $50,000 teaching salary, proud to support the arts program at Jefferson High while my brilliant husband built his empire. When he needed me to sign documents, I'd sign them without question, trusting that he had our best interests at heart. When he claimed his business was struggling due to market conditions, I'd believed every word. When he insisted we needed to liquidate some assets to keep Coleman Technologies afloat, I'd even sold my grandmother's jewelry collection, pieces worth over $2 million that had been in my family for 5 generations. Every single word had been a lie, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to hide the fact that Coleman Technologies was about to be acquired by Morrison Industries for $800 million, with Marcus's personal stake worth approximately $400 million. While I was struggling to stretch our grocery budget and taking on tutoring jobs to help with expenses, my husband was secretly one of the wealthiest men in the state. But the financial deception had been just the beginning. In my previous life, I'd started to notice inconsistencies about 3 months before my death. Little things at first: credit card statements that didn't match his stories about business expenses, phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, a receipt for a woman's jewelry that he'd claimed was a client gift, but which I'd later seen Sarah wearing. When I'd finally worked up the courage to ask questions, Marcus had turned cold in a way that should have terrified me. "You don't understand business, Rebecca," he'd said, his voice carrying a patronizing edge that made me feel stupid and small. "These are complex transactions that require strategic thinking. I need you to trust me." And like the fool I'd been, I had trusted him. Even when I'd discovered the divorce papers he'd hidden in his office. Even when I'd overheard him on the phone discussing the Rebecca problem with someone whose voice I'd later realized was Sarah's. Even when I'd found the life insurance policy he'd taken out on me without my knowledge, with a double indemnity clause for accidental death. I'd confronted him the night before my death, my hands shaking as I'd spread the evidence across our dining table. "What is this, Marcus? What's really going on?" His mask had finally slipped completely. "You were always too smart for your own good, Rebecca. I'd hoped we could do this the easy way, but you just couldn't leave well enough alone." That's when Sarah had emerged from the kitchen with the coffee, her smile as sweet as the poison she'd stirred into my cup. The memory of that betrayal burned in my chest as I watched them now, playing out the same script with one crucial difference. This time, I was ready for them. This time, I'd played my role to perfection from the moment I'd awakened with those terrible memories intact. The heartbroken wife, confused by complex financial documents, easily manipulated into signing papers I claimed not to understand. I'd even perfected the art of looking overwhelmed when Marcus spread contracts across our dining table, mathematical equations and legal jargon swimming before my supposedly confused eyes, while I secretly photographed every page with a hidden camera. But while Marcus thought he was pulling the wool over my eyes for the second time, I was actually documenting every moment of his fraud with the meticulous attention to detail that my art training had given me. The keylogger I'd installed on his personal laptop, disguised as a routine software update that he'd actually requested after I'd subtly suggested his computer seemed slow, had captured everything. Passwords to accounts in 17 different countries. Communications with lawyers who specialized in asset concealment. Video calls with Sarah where they discussed not just the timeline for my accident, but the specific methods they'd considered before, settling on poison as the most undetectable option. I'd learned that Sarah wasn't just Marcus's mistress. She was his business partner in a sophisticated money laundering operation that used her high-end jewelry import business as a front. The rare gemstones she claimed to source from international dealers were actually fictional, with forged invoices allowing them to move millions in illegal proceeds while building a paper trail that looked legitimate to casual inspection. The private investigator I'd hired, Elena Vasquez, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes and had her own reasons for wanting to bring down people like Marcus, had been worth every penny of the $100,000 I'd paid her from a secret account I'd opened using money from private art sales. Elena had photographed Marcus with Sarah months before he'd asked for the divorce, documented their secret apartment in Manhattan that was registered under one of his shell companies, tracked him to banks in Switzerland, the Bahamas, and Luxembourg, and recorded meetings with attorneys who charged $50,000 just for consultations about hiding assets from spouses. Most importantly, I'd quietly retained the services of Diana Chen, the most ruthless divorce attorney on the East Coast, a woman whose reputation for destroying wealthy men who tried to cheat their wives was legendary in legal circles. The same attorney who, in my previous life, had represented Marcus while I'd struggled with an overwhelmed public defender who'd barely returned my calls and had advised me to take what I could get from the settlement. The beauty of it was that Marcus had no idea any of this was happening. In his arrogance, he'd assumed that his naive art teacher wife could never match his sophisticated deception. He'd grown so confident in his ability to manipulate me that he'd stopped being careful, stopped covering his tracks with the paranoid attention to detail that had protected him for years. 3 weeks ago, I'd even helped him plan his own downfall. When he'd complained about his computer running slowly, I'd suggested he needed a software update. When he'd mentioned that his phone was acting strangely, I'd recommended a new app that included monitoring capabilities. When he'd worried about security at the house, I'd agreed that we needed better surveillance, never mentioning that the cameras I'd had installed were recording everything, including his private conversations with Sarah. But perhaps the most satisfying part of my preparation had been the art. In my previous life, Marcus had dismissed my paintings as a cute hobby and pressured me to quit teaching so I could focus on being a proper wife. This time, I'd continued creating in secret, storing my work in a climate-controlled unit across town that Marcus knew nothing about. What he also didn't know was that Eliana had connections in the art world, and my paintings, created with the raw emotion of someone who'd experienced betrayal and death, were already generating interest from collectors who specialized in emotionally powerful works. 3 pieces had sold privately for amounts that would have shocked Marcus if he'd known, providing me with the financial independence to fund my investigation without touching any of our joint accounts. I should probably have my lawyer look this over one more time, I said now, carefully placing my teacup back on its saucer with a slight tremor in my hand that suggested nervousness rather than the anticipation that was actually making my pulse race. Just to make sure I understand everything correctly. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell I'd learned to read during our 8 years of marriage. His left eye twitched when he was stressed about money. His fingers drummed against surfaces when he was planning something that required precise timing, and his jaw clenched when someone threatened to disrupt his carefully laid plans. Right now, all 3 tells were visible if you knew what to look for. "Rebecca, we agreed this was straightforward," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd perfected over years of treating me like a child who couldn't understand grown-up concepts. "Your lawyer already reviewed everything. Thompson said it was all standard language, nothing complicated." Thompson, the public defender who'd been assigned to me by the court system, a well-meaning but overworked man who'd admitted he specialized in criminal defense rather than divorce law. In my previous life, I'd accepted his representation because I couldn't afford anyone better. This time, his primary function had been to provide Marcus with a false sense of security about the level of legal opposition he was facing. "Oh, I fired Thompson 3 days ago," I said casually, watching both their faces with the satisfaction of a chess master announcing checkmate after 20 moves of apparent random play. "I hired Diana Chen instead. You know her, don't you? Just to be absolutely safe." The color drained from Marcus's face so quickly, I thought he might actually faint. His coffee cup rattled against its saucer as his hand began to shake, the tremor starting in his fingers and spreading up his arm like a seismic event. Beside him, Sarah's perfectly composed expression cracked like ice under pressure, her mouth falling open in a way that revealed the expensive veneers she'd bought with money stolen from my inheritance. Diana Chen. The name hung in the air between us like a death sentence, and I could see Marcus's mind racing as he tried to calculate how much trouble he was actually in. Diana's reputation preceded her. She'd destroyed Richard Morrison in a divorce that had made headlines, exposing $50 million in hidden assets and leaving him with barely enough money to afford a studio apartment. She'd taken down tech executives, hedge fund managers, and real estate moguls who'd thought they were too smart to be caught hiding money from their wives. Diana Chen? Sarah's voice cracked slightly, her usual sultry confidence evaporating as she realized that her carefully planned future might be in jeopardy. Isn't she the one who took down Richard Morrison for hiding 50 million from his ex-wife? I finished sweetly, setting down my teacup with deliberate precision, the china making a soft clink that sounded like a bell tolling. Yes, that's her. She's quite thorough. In fact, she's been working on my case for months now. She finds my situation absolutely fascinating. The word months hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stood so abruptly that his chair toppled backward, crashing against the marble floor with a sound like gunshot. His face had gone from pale to gray, and I could see sweat beading along his hairline despite the cool October air conditioning that kept our mansion at a constant 68 degrees. Months, he demanded, his voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before, even in my previous life when he'd been angry about my questions. What do you mean months? You only hired a lawyer 3 weeks ago. You told me Thompson was handling everything. I pulled out my iPhone, the same phone he'd been secretly monitoring through spyware he'd installed months ago, not knowing that I'd discovered his surveillance and had been feeding him carefully crafted false information while conducting my real business on an encrypted device he'd never discovered. The secondary phone was hidden in my art studio downtown, registered under a name that couldn't be traced back to me. I speed dialed Diana's number, and she answered on the first ring, exactly as we'd rehearsed during our strategy sessions in her downtown office. Her voice was clear enough for Marcus and Sarah to hear every word. Diana? Yes, he just signed the papers. Are you ready to proceed with phase 2 of the operation? I paused, listening to her confirmation while watching Marcus's increasingly panicked expression, with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent months planning this exact moment. Perfect. The federal agents should be here any moment. Has Detective Morrison been briefed on the international banking violations? Marcus lunged for my phone with desperate urgency, but I was already moving, backing toward our living room where I'd hidden 3 separate recording devices to document this exact conversation. In my previous life, I'd been caught off guard, helpless, and confused as events spiraled beyond my control. This time, every word, every gesture, every moment of their panic was being captured in high-definition audio and video. What the hell are you doing, Rebecca? His composure shattered completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath the polished entrepreneur facade he'd maintained for years. What did you tell that bitch? What lies have you been spreading? The truth, I said simply, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, even as my heart raced with anticipation. About the $12 million in the Cayman Islands account under the name Marcus Coleman Holdings. The $8 million in Swiss bonds registered to your mother's maiden name, which was quite clever, by the way, using a dead woman's identity. The shell company in Delaware that you've been funneling money through for 2 years. The forged documents claiming Coleman Technologies was failing while you were actually in final negotiations for an $800 million acquisition with Morrison Industries. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm with desperate force, her perfectly manicured nails, painted in Chanel Rouge Noir, the same shade she'd been wearing when she poisoned me, digging into his expensive Armani suit sleeve, hard enough to leave marks that would still be visible when the police photographers documented his arrest. How could she possibly know about... Sarah started, then caught herself as she realized she was about to confess to crimes. But it was too late. The recording devices had captured her partial admission, and the fear in her voice was unmistakable. About how you helped him move money through your jewelry import business? I interrupted, enjoying the look of absolute terror that crossed her surgically perfected face. About the fake receipts for emeralds and diamonds that never existed? About how you've been laundering money for him while planning to eliminate the only witness to your crimes? Or should we talk about the life insurance policy with the double indemnity clause? The room fell silent except for the tick of my grandfather's antique clock, the one I'd supposedly been forced to sell in my previous life to help with our financial difficulties, but which I'd actually secretly moved to a storage unit before Marcus could get his hands on it. The steady rhythm seemed to count down the seconds until their carefully constructed world collapsed completely. "You're bluffing," Marcus said, but his voice shook like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. "You couldn't possibly have evidence of any of this. You don't understand business. You never did. You're just a school teacher who paints pretty pictures." The condescension in his voice sparked the same rage I'd felt in my previous life, but this time I was ready for it. This time I had power. The doorbell chimed, the sound echoing through our marble foyer like a death knell, followed immediately by the authoritative knock of law enforcement officers who weren't going to wait for permission to enter. "That would be Diana," I said, moving toward the front door with measured steps, savoring every moment of their mounting terror. "And probably Detective Morrison. Yes, Richard Morrison's younger brother. Turns out he's very interested in people who commit the same financial crimes that destroyed his family's life. He's been investigating similar cases for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." Marcus grabbed my wrist with brutal force, his grip tight enough to leave bruises, his fingers pressing into the exact spot where he'd held me down while Sarah forced poison down my throat in my previous life. But this time, I wasn't helpless. This time, I'd been training with a self-defense instructor for months, and I was ready. "You can't do this," he hissed, his breath hot against my ear, his voice carrying the same menacing undertone I remembered from my death scene. "We had a deal. You agreed to the settlement. This is breach of contract. The deal was based on fraud," I said, jerking my arm free with strength I'd gained from 6 months of intensive training with Elena's recommendation, a former military instructor who specialized in preparing domestic abuse victims for confrontations with their attackers. "Every document you had me sign, every asset you claimed didn't exist, every lie you told about your company's value. Coleman Technologies is actually worth closer to $400 million, isn't it, Marcus? And that's just the legitimate business. We haven't even talked about the money laundering operation yet." His face went gray as concrete, and I knew I'd hit the target. Elena's investigation had uncovered not just the hidden assets, but the criminal enterprise that had been funding his lifestyle for years. I opened the massive front door to find Diana Chen standing there in her signature black Armani suit, a briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other, looking like an avenging angel dressed for battle in federal court. Behind her stood Detective Morrison, a tall man with kind eyes and graying temples who bore a striking resemblance to his brother Richard, flanked by 2 federal agents I recognized from the photographs Elena had shown me, Agent Rivera from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Agent Thompson from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. "Mrs. Coleman," Diana said, with a razor-sharp smile that had intimidated hundreds of wealthy men into fair settlements over her 20-year career, destroying financial predators. "I have some very interesting news about your husband's actual net worth. I think you're going to be quite surprised by what we've discovered." Behind me, I heard the sound of breaking glass as Marcus apparently tried to destroy evidence, followed by Sarah's shrill scream as she realized their carefully laid plans were crumbling around them. Marcus and Sarah tried to run. They made it exactly 3 steps toward our back patio before Agent Rivera had them both face down on our imported Italian marble, their hands secured behind their backs with federal restraints, while Agent Thompson began reading them their rights in the crisp, professional tone of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "Marcus Coleman," Agent Rivera read from her warrant, her voice carrying the full authority of the federal government. "You're under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to commit murder, violation of federal banking laws, racketeering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest as an accessory to money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, operating an unlicensed money-transmitting business, and conspiracy to defraud the United States." "Murder!" Sarah shrieked, her perfect facade cracking completely as mascara ran down her cheeks in black rivers, destroying the carefully applied makeup that had taken her an hour to perfect this morning. "We never murdered anyone. This is insane. This is some kind of setup." I walked over to where she lay on the floor, crouching down so she could see my face clearly, so she could look into my eyes and see something that might trigger a memory she couldn't quite place. For a moment, I let every ounce of knowledge from my previous life show in my expression. The pain, the betrayal, the absolute certainty of what they'd planned for me, and what they'd already done to me in another timeline. "Not yet," I said quietly, my voice carrying a weight that made her eyes widen in recognition she couldn't quite place, like a half-remembered nightmare. "But you were planning to. The life insurance policy you convinced Marcus to take out on me 8 months ago? The one with the double indemnity clause for accidental death that would pay out $4 million? The brake lines you've been tampering with in my Tesla? The poison you've been researching online using the public computers at the downtown library because you thought that would make it untraceable? Sarah's face went white as fresh snow, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air as she realized the scope of what they knew. Detective Morrison stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder from his briefcase that contained months of surveillance photos, financial records, and digital evidence. We've been monitoring your activities for 6 months, Mr. Coleman. Very interesting internet search history you have. Untraceable poisons that mimic heart attacks. How to cause automotive brake failure without detection. Life insurance investigation procedures for suspicious deaths. How long do toxicology tests take? Should I continue reading your search history aloud? Marcus was hyperventilating now, his perfectly styled hair disheveled and his expensive shirt soaked with sweat, as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his arrogant certainty that he was too smart to be caught. "This is insane," he gasped between ragged breaths. "You can't prove any of this. It's all circumstantial. My lawyers will tear this apart in court. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Diana opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder so thick it required both hands to lift, the pages representing months of meticulous investigation by the best forensic accountants money could buy. "Actually, we can prove all of it," she said with obvious satisfaction. "Your wife was extraordinarily thorough in her documentation. Bank records from 17 countries, recorded conversations, photographs, digital forensics from your computers, testimony from international banking officials, cooperation from the Swiss authorities, and most importantly, a complete confession from Viktor Kozlov himself." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face went from gray to green as he realized that his most dangerous business partner had apparently decided to cooperate with federal authorities rather than face life in prison. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Viktor would never." "Viktor Kozlov was arrested 3 months ago in Monaco," Agent Thompson interrupted, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been working this case for years. "He's been very cooperative in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's told us everything about the money laundering operation, the shell companies, the cryptocurrency scheme, and most interestingly, about your plan to eliminate your wife once the divorce was finalized." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized how close I'd come to death even in this timeline. Without my memories from the previous life, I would have signed those papers and been dead within weeks, probably from what would have appeared to be a tragic car accident. Diana handed me a document, and I couldn't suppress the smile that spread across my face as I read the numbers that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. "According to our forensic accounting," Diana announced, her voice carrying across our marble foyer like a victory speech, "your husband's actual net worth is approximately $960 million. This includes the true valuation of Coleman Technologies, which is being acquired not for the $800 million that was publicly announced, but for $1.2 billion due to the proprietary technology that Marcus failed to disclose in the original negotiations." I looked at Marcus, who was now slumped against our antique console table, the weight of his exposed crimes finally hitting him like a physical blow that left him gasping for air. "The forensic analysis also reveals," Diana continued, clearly enjoying every moment of Marcus's destruction, "real estate holdings in 12 countries, investment portfolios managed by firms in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, ownership stakes in 47 different companies through various shell corporations, and most significantly, the proceeds from years of money laundering operations that we've traced back to organized crime syndicates in Eastern Europe." The numbers were so large they seemed abstract, like something from a movie rather than real life. In my previous life, I'd died believing we were nearly bankrupt, worrying about grocery money while my husband was secretly one of the wealthiest criminals in the country. "Since all of this wealth was accumulated during your marriage," I said, reading from Diana's summary with growing amazement, "and since he attempted to hide it through fraudulent means while planning to murder you to prevent discovery, you're entitled to half of everything, plus punitive damages for fraud, plus emotional distress compensation, plus attorney fees, plus a substantial settlement for the attempted murder conspiracy." Diana's smile could have powered the city grid. That means Rebecca will be receiving approximately $640 million plus the family estate, plus restoration of all personal property that was illegally sold, plus ongoing royalties from patents that were registered in her name without her knowledge, plus a percentage of any additional assets we recover as the investigation continues. The room spun around me as I tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. I was about to become one of the wealthiest women in America, with enough money to do anything I wanted for the rest of my life. "This isn't over," Marcus snarled as Agent Rivera hauled him to his feet, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who knew he'd already lost everything. "You think you're so smart, Rebecca, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. The people I work with, the connections I have, they won't let this stand. You'll never be safe." "You mean the connections to the Kozlov money laundering operation?" Agent Thompson interrupted, pulling out his own set of documents that looked like they could stock a small library. "The one that's been under federal investigation for 3 years? The same organization that's been using your tech company to clean money from Eastern European arms deals, human trafficking, and drug operations?" Marcus's face went from gray to green as the full scope of his legal troubles became clear. "We know about Victor Kozlov's 40% investment in Coleman Technologies," Detective Morrison added, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been working toward this moment for years. "We know about the server farms in Romania that have nothing to do with legitimate business. We know about the cryptocurrency mining operation that's actually a front for laundering money from human trafficking. We know about the arms deals with Syrian rebels that were financed through your company's accounts." I felt the blood drain from my own face as I realized the true scope of what I'd unknowingly been married to. Even with my memories from the previous life, I hadn't known about this level of criminal activity. Marcus hadn't just been hiding assets. He'd been running an international criminal enterprise that was responsible for suffering on a scale I couldn't comprehend. "Rebecca had no knowledge of these activities," Diana said quickly, stepping closer to me in a protective gesture as she realized I was struggling to process the magnitude of Marcus's crimes. "Our investigation confirms that she was deliberately kept in the dark about all business operations. In fact, she was specifically targeted for marriage because her background as an art teacher made her appear to be an ideal cover for his criminal activities." "Actually," Agent Rivera said, looking at me with something approaching respect, "Mrs. Coleman's cooperation has been invaluable to our investigation. The evidence she provided allowed us to connect Marcus Coleman to crimes we've been investigating for years. Without her courage in coming forward, we might never have been able to build a case strong enough to bring down the entire operation." As they led Marcus toward the door, I followed on unsteady legs, the full scope of what I'd unknowingly been part of making me feel nauseated and grateful in equal measure. "One more thing," I called out as they loaded him into the federal vehicle. He looked at me through the bulletproof window, his face twisted with a rage so pure it was almost primal, his eyes holding a hatred that made me grateful for the protective glass between us. "In case you're wondering how I knew about the brake lines, I had my car serviced by federal mechanics 6 months ago. Every time you or Sarah tampered with it, they documented the sabotage and repaired it. I haven't been in any real danger for months." The look of absolute defeat that crossed his face was almost worth dying for, almost. But I wasn't done. There was one final piece of information I'd been saving for this moment. "Oh, and Marcus," I called out one final time, savoring the moment as he turned back to look at me through the window. "That art collection you forced me to sell last year? The one you said was worthless amateur work that embarrassed you in front of your business associates. Sotheby's appraised it at $12 million. Apparently, I'm quite talented. The buyer was actually Elena's contact in the art world, and every piece is safely stored in a climate-controlled facility waiting for my first gallery show next month." Sarah was loaded into a separate vehicle, still sobbing and screaming about how this was all Marcus's fault, how she'd been manipulated and deceived, how she'd never meant for things to go so far. But I remembered the look in her eyes as she'd watched me die in my previous life. The satisfaction on her face as the poison worked through my system, the way she'd laughed as I convulsed on the kitchen floor. Some people deserve no mercy, and Sarah Mitchell was one of them. As the federal vehicles disappeared down our circular driveway, I stood in the doorway of the mansion that was now truly mine, watching my old life drive away in handcuffs while my new life stretched out before me like an infinite canvas waiting to be painted. 6 months later, I stood on the terrace of my new penthouse in Manhattan, a space that had once belonged to one of Marcus's shell companies, but now legally belonged to me as part of the settlement that had made headlines around the world. Diana had been absolutely ruthless in pursuing every hidden asset, every secret account, every property he'd tried to conceal through layers of corporate obfuscation so complex it had taken teams of forensic accountants months to unravel them completely. The view from the 62nd floor was breathtaking, the city sprawling out below me like a glittering circuit board of possibilities. Central Park looked like a green postage stamp from this height, and the Hudson River caught the afternoon sun like a ribbon of molten silver threading through the urban landscape I now surveyed like a queen overlooking her domain. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Final Kozlov trial verdict, guilty on all counts. Your testimony was instrumental in securing justice for dozens of victims. Also, the Morrison Industries acquisition complications have been resolved in your favor. Your stake in the final settlement is now worth $847 million after all international assets were recovered. The Swiss banks have finally released the last of the hidden accounts. Congratulations, Rebecca. You've officially become one of the wealthiest women in America. I smiled, setting the phone aside and picking up my grandmother's jewelry from the velvet-lined box on my coffee table. Every piece had been recovered from the buyers, who turned out to be Marcus's associates, holding them in trust for Sarah's personal collection in a scheme that would have seen my family heirlooms decorating the neck of the woman who'd murdered me. The vintage sapphire necklace caught the afternoon light, sending blue sparkles across the polished marble floor like tiny stars celebrating my victory. The newspaper on my side table told the story in bold headlines that still gave me satisfaction every time I read them. Tech CEO sentenced to life without parole in international money laundering scheme. The article detailed how Marcus Coleman and Sarah Mitchell had been convicted not just of financial crimes, but of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, racketeering, and serving as key figures in a criminal organization that had been responsible for laundering over $8 billion in illegal proceeds. Marcus had been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, his assets seized by the federal government and distributed among his victims, with the largest portion rightfully coming to me as his legal wife who'd been targeted for murder. Sarah had received 45 years in federal prison, which at her age meant she would likely die behind bars, her beauty fading in a concrete cell far from the luxury she'd tried to steal. But my favorite article was framed on the wall of my home office. Local teachers' hidden masterpieces sell for record prices. My painting, Betrayal in Blue, an abstract representation of the moment I'd realized my husband was planning to kill me, had sold at auction for $3.2 million, with the entire proceeds going to the Rebecca Coleman Foundation for Abused Women. The foundation had become my life's work and my greatest source of pride. Starting with a modest investment of $50 million, pocket change compared to my total settlement, it had grown into a national organization that provided resources for women escaping abusive marriages and financial exploitation. Our headquarters occupied 3 floors of a Manhattan office building, with satellite offices in 12 major cities and plans to expand internationally. Already, we'd helped over 3,000 women discover hidden assets their husbands had tried to steal, connecting them with attorneys who specialized in exposing financial deception and forensic accountants who could unravel even the most complex schemes. Our legal team had uncovered over $15 billion in hidden assets, helping women across the country and internationally reclaim money that was rightfully theirs. The foundation's success had exposed a network of financial advisors, lawyers, and offshore banking specialists who made their living helping wealthy men cheat their wives out of marital assets. 17 other men running schemes similar to Marcus's had been arrested and convicted, leading to federal investigations that were still ongoing across multiple countries. But perhaps most importantly, we'd prevented 43 planned murders. Our database of suspicious insurance policies, combined with AI analysis of spending patterns and behavioral changes, had identified women whose lives were in immediate danger from husbands planning to kill them for insurance money or to prevent asset discovery. Every single one of those women was now safe. There would be killers in prison where they belonged. I'd also quietly purchased the house where Marcus and Sarah had lived when they murdered me in my previous life. It was now a safe house for women whose lives were in immediate danger from their partners, staffed with former military and law enforcement professionals, and equipped with security technology that made it impossible for abusers to track their victims. My art studio took up the entire 59th floor of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light throughout the day. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, others in progress, all of them expressions of emotions I'd never been allowed to feel in my previous life. The waiting list for my work now included museums around the world, and the Whitney was planning a retrospective exhibition titled Resurrection: Art from the Ashes of Betrayal. The gallery showing that had opened last month had been completely sold out within hours, with collectors paying hundreds of thousands for paintings I'd created in secret during my marriage, while Marcus dismissed my little hobby. The New York Times art critic had called my work viscerally powerful explorations of survival and transformation that speak to the universal experience of betrayal and renewal. Every painting sold for between $500,000 and $2 million, with all proceeds funding scholarships for women pursuing art education after escaping abusive relationships. The scholarship program had already helped over 200 women rebuild their lives through creative expression. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus had tried to steal not just my money and my life, but my artistic identity as well. In my previous life, he'd convinced me that my art wasn't good enough to show publicly, that it was embarrassing to have a wife whose amateur paintings might reflect poorly on his professional image. His systematic destruction of my confidence had been just another form of abuse, designed to keep me dependent and grateful for his support. And now my art was hanging in homes of celebrities, tech executives, and art collectors around the world. A piece titled Phoenix Rising had been acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art for their permanent collection. Another, The Weight of Lies, was being featured in a traveling exhibition about domestic abuse that would visit 50 cities over the next 2 years. I walked to my easel where my latest painting was taking shape. It was a self-portrait, but not the timid, uncertain woman I'd been in my first life. This Rebecca had fire in her eyes, strength in her posture, and most importantly, the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving the ultimate betrayal and choosing to use that experience to protect others. My phone rang. Elena Vasquez, the private investigator who'd become not just my closest business partner, but one of my dearest friends. "Rebecca, I've got news about the Eastern European Network," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who just made a major breakthrough. "The FBI is ready to move on the rest of the operation. They've identified over 200 potential victims across 15 countries. They want to know if you're willing to testify in the international tribunals." "All of them," I said without hesitation, setting down my paintbrush and walking to the window that overlooked the city I'd helped make safer for countless women. "Whatever it takes to make sure none of these people can hurt anyone else." "There's something else," Elena continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "We found something in the evidence recovered from the Swiss accounts. Documentation of 17 other women who died under suspicious circumstances after marrying men in similar financial situations. The International Task Force thinks there might be dozens more cases we haven't discovered yet." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. My second chance at life had given me the power to save others, but it had also revealed horrors I couldn't have imagined. A systematic network of wealthy men who used marriage as a weapon to exploit and ultimately eliminate women who trusted them. "Send me everything," I said, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what Elena was describing. "If there are other women who died the way I did, their families deserve justice. And if there are other women currently at risk, they deserve protection." "The task force wants to offer you a position as a special consultant," Elena added. "Your insights into the psychology of these predators, combined with your resources and your public platform, could be invaluable in identifying and stopping them." I thought about the invitation for a moment, weighing the personal cost against the potential to save lives. In my previous life, I'd been a victim. In this life, I'd become an avenger. Perhaps it was time to evolve once more, from avenger to protector. "Set up the meeting," I said, "but I have conditions. The Foundation gets full access to any intelligence that could help us identify at-risk women. We get advance warning of any planned operations so we can protect potential victims. And we get to vet any plea deals to make sure these monsters don't get reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. They're not going to like the conditions, Elena warned. They don't have to like them, I replied, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned that money was just another form of power, and power was only useful if you were willing to use it. They need what I can provide more than I need their approval. I have resources they don't, connections they can't access, and most importantly, I understand these predators in a way that traditional law enforcement never will. After hanging up, I stood at my window watching the sun set over the city that had become my kingdom. Somewhere out there, other women were living the life I'd lived in my first timeline, trusting husbands who were secretly planning their destruction, signing documents they didn't understand, believing lies about financial hardship while their partners accumulated fortunes built on crime and deception. But now they had an ally they didn't even know existed. The Rebecca Coleman Foundation's hotline received over 2,000 calls a week from women who suspected their husbands were hiding assets or planning something sinister. Our team of forensic accountants, private investigators, and attorneys had become the most effective force in the world for unraveling the complex schemes wealthy predators use to exploit their wives. We'd also developed an AI system that analyzed insurance policies, bank account activity, and even social media behavior to identify women whose lives might be in danger. The system had already flagged over 300 cases where wives were at risk, allowing us to intervene before tragedies occurred. I raised my wine glass, a 1982 Bordeaux worth more than most people's annual salaries, to the city lights beginning to twinkle below like earthbound stars. Thank you, I whispered to my past self. The woman who'd died alone and betrayed, but whose death had ultimately given me the power to save so many others. The woman who'd trusted too easily, who'd signed documents without reading them, who'd believed in love when she should have been watching for lies. Her naivety had been her weakness, but it had also been her gift to me, the knowledge of how good people could be deceived and therefore how they could be protected. In the distance, sirens wailed, perhaps another emergency, another life hanging in the balance. But for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I wasn't afraid of the sound. I was no longer the victim of other people's schemes. I was the woman who ended them. My reflection in the window showed someone I barely recognized from either lifetime. Confident, powerful, dangerous in the way that justice could be dangerous to those who deserved it. The scared art teacher was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to become the apex predator yourself. Tomorrow, I would continue building my empire of justice. I would testify against more criminals, help more women escape financial abuse, and create art that spoke truth to a world that too often protected the powerful at the expense of the innocent. The war was far from over. There were more Marcus Colemans out there, more Sarah Mitchells, more criminal networks that used marriage as a weapon against women who trusted too easily. But now they had an enemy they'd never expected. A woman who'd died once and come back stronger, smarter, and absolutely determined to make sure that no one else would suffer the way she had. The city lights stretched to the horizon, each one representing a life, a story, a potential victim who might need saving. I had the resources now, not just money, but knowledge, connections, and most importantly, the unshakable conviction that came from having already lost everything once. I would not lose again, and neither would any woman who called my foundation for help. In my previous life, I'd been Rebecca Coleman, victim. In this life, I was Rebecca Coleman, protector of the innocent and destroyer of those who would prey upon them. And I was just getting started. The foundation was planning to go international next year, opening offices in London, Tokyo, and Sydney to help women around the world escape financial abuse. We were developing new technology to track hidden assets across international borders, building partnerships with law enforcement agencies in dozens of countries, and training a new generation of investigators who specialized in financial crimes against women. My art was funding research into the psychology of financial predators, helping psychologists and criminologists understand the patterns that could identify these men before they struck. Every painting I sold supported another woman's escape from abuse, another family's journey to safety, another predator's conviction and imprisonment. As I prepared for bed in my penthouse palace, surrounded by luxury I'd earned through suffering and wisdom I'd paid for with my life, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal victory. Marcus Coleman was lying on a narrow cot in ADX Florence, the supermax prison reserved for the most dangerous criminals in America, counting the days until his death in a place where his money meant nothing and justice was served one day at a time. But more importantly, thousands of women around the world were sleeping safely in their own beds tonight because of the work I'd built from the ashes of my first life's destruction. I was finally, completely triumphantly free. And I intended to use that freedom to make sure that every woman like me, every victim of financial abuse, every wife whose husband was secretly planning her destruction, had the tools and support she needed to not just survive, but to thrive. The work would never be finished. There would always be more predators to stop, more women to save, more justice to be served. But I had eternity to get it right, and I had already proven that death itself couldn't stop me.